This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 960 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog.
Thanks for tuning in.
Before we get into the mailbag questions this week, I want to remind you to check out Underdog. Right now over on Underdog, you can enter into snake drafts for this week's slate of games, but there are playoff contests available for you too. If you think that you have a better grasp on the league's playoff picture than others right now, then you can have a serious edge in those contests. To check them out and more, head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the Underdog app. And when you sign up, of course, use promo code LATEROUND. That'll get you a really nice deposit offer, as well as my rest of season rankings if you still want those. Again, UnderdogFantasy.com, promo code LATEROUND. The first question this week is from Patreon. It's from Isaac. It says, can you speak more about Jayden Reed? Was this a one-game wonder with 0 catches, or is this past week's showing in line with the peripherals? Moving forward, can someone trust him in their lineup, especially after the team put up 31 points and didn't use Reed? So I got a couple of questions about Jayden Reed and his goose egg. Let's talk about him. Now, I've brought up Reed's peripherals multiple times on the show over the last couple of months. How there seems to be an anchoring bias going on with him, given how hot he started the season. But make no mistake, he has not been that strong of a fantasy asset. Reed's averaging 10 PPR points per game since week 4. He's seen more than 6 targets in a game just once. Because the Packers have found their run game, they've been way below 0 in pass rate over expected over their last 6 games, every single game. According to Fantasy Life data, they've been above average in pass rate over expected just 3 times this year. So that's playing a role. But so is their deployment of Reed. The hope was that he'd get more run after starting the season off so strong, but he hasn't. They like to use him in the slot. He's run over 77% of his routes from the slot this year, according to PFF. Meanwhile, Green Bay is 12th in the NFL in 11 personnel usage. So they're not using Jayden Reed on every down like they would a perimeter receiver. And we saw that in week 14. Against the Lions, where they went pretty run-heavy overall, Christian Watson ran a route on 22 of a possible 24 dropbacks. Jayden Reed was at 15 of a possible 24. So there are 2 things sort of coming together here for Reed. Number 1, the Packers are run-heavy. Only 2 teams have a lower pass rate than the Packers this year, the Steelers and the Eagles. Green Bay has actually been dead last in pass rate in neutral game script environments. Other pass rate over expected formulas have the Packers easily in the bottom 5. They are a run-heavy team. That obviously means that fewer targets are going to go around. But then you layer on the fact that Reed isn't a full-time player because they use him in the slot. You've got a recipe for really inconsistent production. This isn't new, though. The 0 that he took in a very good matchup for slot receivers, that was kind of new, and that was pretty bad. But Reed has been largely big play and touchdown dependent all year long, which can make him still viable because he's a really good player, and good players can make those things happen more often, but it also makes him extremely volatile. This is why I went from being higher than the market on Reed around weeks 3 or 4, and then I've been way lower than the market ever since, because they didn't change his usage, and the Packers started to really make it clear that they wanted to run the ball this year. It's torpedoed Jayden Reed's fantasy value. He's definitely tough to trust. I do expect them to use him a little bit more this week. They'll probably force the issue a little bit too. But overall, Jayden Reed is not a must start in fantasy football. It's been that way for a while. The next question is from Twitter. It's from @BillyScrimshot. It says, how did Sincere McCormick look in your prospect model, both pre and post draft? I thought he was going to be a good dynasty sleeper, but didn't expect it to take quite so long for him to get a shot. Your thoughts for 2025 and beyond? So when Sincere McCormick started to get more work, I think it was easy to brush it off as nothing of significance. But looking at my prospect model in more detail, he went undrafted, so that hurts his score. But he had some really good marks. Now, some of that's because he went to a smaller program. His production at that program is going to naturally be better than someone who played at like Ohio State. But I've also found that draft capital largely captures that side of things. We don't need to heavily adjust. The problem, though, McCormick didn't get draft capital. That makes it a tougher situation to navigate. But as you guys know, I introduced breakout score this past year in the model. And McCormick had a 94.5 breakout score. That's really, really good. His top season in yards per team play was over 2. He had a top prorated reception share season of 11.3%. Now, the nice part about having my prospect guides is I can now look back and see how I felt about a prospect when they were coming out. Because McCormick wasn't drafted, I didn't have any sort of post-draft update with him. But I did profile him in the guide pre-draft because he did go to the NFL Combine. And his profile's really brief because he wasn't a high-end player. But this is from the prospect guide. This is the first prospect guide that I ever produced. It says, McCormick is another smaller school back who had solid production marks in the Z prospect model, which is now the ZAP model. The one spot to knock him may be on the athleticism side, since he turned in a speed score of just 91.6. That's awfully close to not hitting the model's threshold of 90, which, by the way, I don't calculate it the exact same way these days. And then the blurb finishes by saying, but he got there, and the model likes him, at least compared to projected draft capital, as a result. So my numbers actually liked McCormick. It's just that him not doing anything until 2024 made it kind of difficult to be overly bullish. But we and I, because I didn't talk about this until now, we should have been more excited than the market when McCormick started to see a little bit more work. And that's my bad. That's on me. Regardless, I actually think he's a decent player. This next question is also from Twitter. It says, besides Brock Bowers, are there any other 2024 draft class tight ends that are making an impact and carving a role on his team moving forward? So again, this is where I love having the prospect model to sort of see where I was at entering the season versus where things are at right now. Brock Bowers had a ZAP model score of 99.3. He was an elite prospect. And there was a pretty decent gap to Ben Sinnott, who was at 83.9. Now, I wouldn't give up on Sinnott just yet, but I also didn't like him the same way that others did back in the draft process. To me, there wasn't a big enough delta between him and someone like Theo Johnson, who had a score of 73.4. I actually like what I saw from Johnson, too. His yards per route run isn't very good, but he was starting to come on before his injury. And you could just see his athleticism beginning to translate. That's why he looked okay in the ZAP model. He's a freak athlete. And that matters more at tight end than other positions. But I don't know. I saw this class as sort of being Brock Bowers as this elite player, and then some role players in there, like tight end 2 types. Like Eric All, I think he could have a bright future if he could stay healthy. Maybe Jatavian Sanders. But I wasn't overly optimistic about any of them. I didn't think we'd necessarily see elite tight end 1 production outside of Bowers. And then one player to also maybe stash would be Jaheim Bell. The model really liked him versus where he was drafted. He hasn't gotten that much run this year, but he was an interesting prospect who's attached to a very good up-and-coming quarterback in Drake May. So I think you should be stashing Jaheim Bell. The last question this week is an email. It says, love the work you do. Thanks. My question is around if we should rethink the thought process that rushing quarterbacks are bad for their team's running backs. Is this true? Or have rushing quarterbacks historically just had subpar talent on their team at the running back position? This year in PPR points per game, Saquon Barkley is the RB1, Derrick Henry is the RB3, James Cook is the RB12. We've also seen RB2 level production from Jonathan Taylor, James Conner, and Brian Robinson Jr. Should we change our approach in valuing running backs that have a rushing quarterback? Thanks, Taylor. So I think this is just one of those topics that I've talked about over the years that's been taken just too far. Because it's one of those things that gets brought up in discussions pretty frequently. Like I'll see random back and forth on Twitter or on Reddit or something, and someone will be like, well, JJ Zacharyson says that you shouldn't draft running backs on teams with mobile quarterbacks. But that's really not true. Something that's really important to remember is that I share these studies. I do research, I share the results, but I'm trying to constantly evolve. I don't see something published in 2019 or 2020 or even 2021 as necessarily relevant today, especially if I've done more work on the topic. But some people only hear and remember those original studies. So they continue to say the things from those studies over and over again, which I totally understand. No one's at fault here. This is just how this relationship kind of works. Not everyone is going to hear and consume every single thing that I'm publishing. You might listen to this podcast and not read the draft guide. You might not listen to this podcast and you do read the draft guide. Or maybe you just see the things that I tweet or put on social media. I understand that that's how this works. My job is just be as clear as possible across all of those platforms, across all of those pieces of content. A good example of this is actually the ambiguous RB1 theory, for anyone who remembers that. I've said time and time again that I was wrong to publish that study. And there were some flaws in that study, which is going to happen. This to me is all part of this game. What we think is true 5 or 6 years ago is not necessarily true now. This goes for anything in life, but not everyone is being reached. When I talk about those topics again, not everyone hears what I'm talking about. And I understand that's going to happen, but I still try to be open and transparent when my opinion on things change. So let me reframe all of this. In the draft guide this year, I wrote the following when talking about this exact topic. When talking about mobile quarterbacks with running backs. I said, we generally see slightly lower running back target shares on teams with mobile quarterbacks. We also see those running passers take some goal line work, lowering a back's touchdown total. These numbers aren't super dramatic, so don't take them too far. But they do contradict what you've likely heard before. Mobile quarterbacks are not good for running backs. They are, at best, neutral. In other words, the stuff that I've talked about with mobile quarterbacks, it's not so much an avoid thing, but more so that people take this in the opposite direction, thinking that since mobile quarterbacks create better efficiency, that their running backs will be better in fantasy because they'll be more efficient. But just take a look at the examples that you shared in this question. Saquon Barkley is breaking fantasy football right now, but Philadelphia is also pacing to score well over 50 touchdowns this year. And they've also seen an incredibly high proportion of their touchdowns come via the ground. They have a 39% pass to rush touchdown rate. That's trending to be the third lowest that we've seen since 2011. Barkley's doing great in this environment, but what's wild is that he could actually be even better, if not for the tush push. If not for the fact that Jalen Hurts has stolen touchdowns from Saquon Barkley. Now, I'm not saying that Hurts hasn't helped Barkley's efficiency. I'm more so saying that there's actually more of a ceiling here. And he's not hitting that ceiling because Jalen Hurts is mobile. And I think it's okay to recognize that the Eagles are one of the run heaviest teams that we've seen in some time. They're scoring a ton of touchdowns on the ground. Situationally, this is kind of an outlier, genuinely. And then you add on the talent factor, which is Saquon Barkley being an excellent running back, you get this result. It's really easy to say this all in hindsight, of course. But we can't assume that the mobile quarterback is the reason that Saquon Barkley is having such a good year. It goes way beyond that. And then Derrick Henry's another one. He's never been like any other running back that we've ever seen. He doesn't need high target shares to be relevant even in PPR formats. And then Jonathan Taylor, you mentioned Jonathan Taylor. In my eyes, he's actually a pretty good example of mobile quarterbacks being bad for running backs. His target share splits with and without Anthony Richardson are pretty crazy. I talked about that on a recent 10 Trends episode. He's been a general disappointment this year versus where people drafted him. Now, I could go on and on about the individual players that are being mentioned here, but I don't think those individual players necessarily screw up the general idea. That general idea being that historically mobile quarterbacks have technically been more bad than good for running backs. And that we shouldn't assume efficiency running the ball means better fantasy numbers. A crazy season from the Eagles offense, just in terms of how that offense is operating, shouldn't derail that thought. Because look, I could go in the opposite direction too. Najee Harris was way worse with Justin Fields. Jonathan Taylor, as I already noted, he's seen better peripherals with Joe Flacco. I mean, if we want to, we could even talk about Josh Jacobs with Malik Willis. Even just his peripherals. Jacobs saw one total target in Willis's 2 starts. Like, of course his numbers are going to be worse because the offense is going to be worse. But you could just peep the peripherals and see how things change. I think oftentimes, though, people lead with the trend and then they dig into the players afterwards. Even I'm guilty of that sometimes. But it needs to go in the opposite direction. Lean into the player, his situation, all that comes with his fantasy value. That's going to be more important than the trends that I talk about. The trends are high level. Using singular examples doesn't disprove the trend. The trend is just generally telling you what direction these things go in. But also, like a trend like this helps you guys not have to build out projections for players. You can sort of do some of that work on your own. A lot of this stuff does show up in projections. If a quarterback is taking away plays, if he's scoring touchdowns on the ground, that's going to show up in a player's projection. And if you use projections as a general guide, then there's a chance that you'll then be lower on that player, just naturally. But I don't know. I think it's okay to say that Saquon Barkley ended up seeing an almost ideal situation for fantasy purposes this year, and that not all of this was even projectable. It's okay to recognize that Derrick Henry is a different back. I don't think that necessarily tells us that we now should be ignoring what honestly at its core is pretty intuitive. There are only so many plays that a team can run in a game. If 8 to 15 of those plays are going to go to a quarterback and the quarterback only, it's going to naturally impact the rest of the team. Unless that team is just very, very good, which is what we're seeing with Baltimore and Philadelphia. For a running back to combat all of this, to beat all of this, that running back would need to be in a favorable situation. He'd need to be on a team that's scoring well above average in the touchdown column, on a team that's really leaning on that player, which is exactly what's going on with Derrick Henry and Saquon Barkley. So hopefully that answers your question. That whole mobile quarterback thing, it was a small edge more than anything else. But it was designed to tell people to not inflate running backs on teams with mobile quarterbacks like some do. That's a pretty common narrative out there. People get excited about what that uptick in efficiency might do. But there's often a lack of recognition of the downtick in touchdowns and oftentimes targets. Also, I can't wait to dig into this stuff more in the offseason. I think you guys are going to be shocked by how different the running back position was this year compared to most years. And it's going to be the biggest thing that we all have to analyze before the 2025 season. And I can't wait. But that's it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Late Round QB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I got a Late Round Perspectives episode dropping later today. Hope you give that a listen. Otherwise, good luck in the first week of the playoffs. I'll talk to you next week.